Bom, muito boa tarde a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Em nome da Garagem Sul, queria agradecer a todos a vossa presença. Esta é a terceira das conferências da Garagem, mas é também para a Garagem Sul um dia relativamente especial, na medida em que temos finalmente pronto uma coisa muito singela, muito simples, uma pequena brochura, uma conversa que tivemos com o arquiteto José Neves a propósito da praça no verão, que esteve durante os meses de verão na praça do Centro Cultural de Belém. É uma pequena publicação que retoma um formato e uma dimensão que acompanhou algumas das primeiras exposições na Garagem Sul, nomeadamente a exposição do Sou Fujimoto e a exposição Tanto Mar, e que garante, enquanto objeto físico, uma memória do que se foi passando e das ideias que foram transitando, estacionando e percorrendo outros caminhos no espaço da Garagem Sul. Uma praça no verão, como vocês provavelmente sabem, foi um projeto efêmero que iremos repetir no próximo verão, mas para além dessa cortiça que hoje está ainda estão alguns vestígios no fundo da praça, ficamos com este registro e pretendemos dar continuidade e sequência a esta construção de ideias no espaço da garagem. E o facto de ela coincidir com mais uma das conferências da garagem, hoje com o convidado Sam Jacob, permite entender um pouco melhor da programação que se está a desenhar para os próximos anos, de um lugar, de um espaço no Centro Cultural de Belém, em que não apenas acolhemos e recebemos exposições, mas literalmente trocamos, articulamos ideias e pensamento sobre a construção da arquitetura, a construção da cidade, a nossa própria construção enquanto sociedade. E este momento em que se intersetam o programa das exposições com a exposição do Fernando Guerra, o raio-x de uma prática fotográfica, com a conferência do Sam Jacob aqui na Sala Luís de Freitas Branco, com a publicação e a garantia de que haverá uma memória duradoura da construção e das memórias mais fugazes do verão de 2017, começam a desenhar esta programação conjunta que é feita por todos nós, na medida em que é a vossa presença cá hoje, com as vossas ideias e o trabalho e a memória que levam destas conferências e os debates que estas oportunidades permitem, que dão corpo a uma galeria de exposições de arquitetura, que dão corpo a um programa de arquitetura que se quer interventivo na cidade. Não me vou alongar mais nestas considerações genéricas sobre a garagem, porque mais do que estas ideias genéricas do que é uma programação, o que é importante, o que é realmente importante é a programação em si, é a conferência que o Sam nos vai trazer aqui hoje e os debates que dela se seguirão. O Sam Jacob é arquiteto, tem ateliê em Londres e é professor de arquitetura em Chicago, e é uma das personagens fundamentais, diria eu, numa certa reconstrução da cultura arquitetónica contemporânea, e é particularmente gratificante tê-lo cá num momento em que em Chicago a Bienal de Arquitetura está a correr, está a lançar polémica, precisamente pela dimensão como uma certa ideia de arquitetura, ou uma certa forma de arquitetura reconquista espaço no panorama da crítica contra, eventualmente, ou a par, ou em paralelo a outras formas de crítica e de exercício da profissão. E que, eventualmente, seria alguma da crítica que se faz à Bienal de Chicago excessivamente formalista, excessivamente ancorada na prática da construção, na prática da arquitetura e não tanto nos problemas sociais que essa prática envolve, que essa prática traz consigo. E parece-me, e fico muito feliz por termos cá o Sam hoje, na medida em que é uma das vozes mais fortes ao combinar aquilo que é o exercício da profissão de arquiteto, a construção de obra, com a construção de um argumento crítico em relação à sociedade e de um argumento intelectual sobre como pode e deve ser a produção da arquitetura. Ou seja, tomar a arquitetura como um espaço para a construção de sentido, como um espaço para a construção de ideias e a arquitetura ter essa capacidade de significar. E nessa medida, nessa construção de significado que a arquitetura pode trazer consigo, o Sam resgatou e é um dos, poderemos dizer, culpados, lá no Porto dirão culpados, seguramente, de uma certa redescoberta do pós-moderno como um elemento qualificado e útil e a herança da pós-modernidade como sendo uma arca dos tesouros para pensarmos a arquitetura hoje. Não vou continuar a falar porque temos a possibilidade de ter estas ideias na primeira pessoa e por isso, Sam, as I told you, you would not get much of what I was saying, but I was saying good words about you, I hope so. And I invite you to join your ideas and to share your ideas with us. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. It's great to be here. And I'm going to try and share with you tonight really some ideas about architecture and about, I suppose, like how architectural ideas can help us understand aspects of the world. That's not a good start. That's better. But also how those ideas also shape architecture. So sort of intrinsically how the world and architecture are essentially always together, but our role as architects is to kind of understand the world and shape architecture. I'm going to begin with a piece of history. It's actually a bit of history from slightly before my time, but it's kind of where I came out of. Now, this is Prince Charles, and in the late 1980s, Prince Charles decided to take a break from being just a royal and decided to give his view of architecture to Britain. In fact, he wrote this book called A Vision of Britain and made a TV show which essentially kind of promoted an idea of traditional architecture. Now, what that did to British architectural culture was absolutely terrible. It essentially polarized any discussion about architecture, that it would either be traditional or it would be modern, and there was nothing in between. And that was essentially the state of play in British architectural discussions, well, I'd say for 15 years, and actually really beneath the surface, it remains the same. I mean, some people might say that was always the case, that British people never really understood modern architecture. I might be one of them. What I think this polarized view of architecture is absolutely problematic, because it never allows this engagement between the world and architecture to create something which is actually a vital force in shaping the world within which we live. So what I'm going to argue for is an unpolarized, non-black and white, much more spectrum, much more ambiguity, and for an argument for tensions that can remain unresolved, or that can produce new kinds of work. So the first thing I'm going to show is a few sketches that I made in conjunction with Prince Charles. So as a hobby, when he's not talking about architecture, when he's not being just a royal, he likes to do watercolours. And these watercolours, or the originals at least, are of beautiful scenes of the British countryside. This looks like it might well be Scotland or the Lake District or something like this. And of course what they do, both in their medium, like a kind of old-fashioned idea of art, doing watercolours of landscape, and their subject matter, these protected bits of natural environment, which are the kinds of things you find on biscuit tins, and BBC dramas would be shot in their presence. Of course, I've inserted something which is completely antithetical to that scene, these large, blank, abstract shapes. Now, of course, I also love these kinds of places. I also like watercolours of landscapes, but I also recognise that in order for those to exist, we need to have the kind of complexities of the modern world. So a simplistic view of the world should look like Prince Charles's original watercolours is not just nostalgic, it's also actually unviable. The reality of the situation is these kinds of places need to have these kinds of abstract systems applied over them in order for them to survive. What those sketches also talk about, I think, is an idea that is very important to architecture, which is the idea of representation. Now, we're familiar with that in terms of drawing, but I'm going to try to talk about it in terms of a much broader idea of how all architecture actually remains a form of representation. But to start with, I want to talk about, I guess, languages of representation. So these are a series of drawings that I've been working on with my students, or rather my students have been making for me in the studios over the last couple of years. And what they try to do is bring together very different sources, very different ways of drawing, very different combinations of subject matter and the method of representation. So, for example, the keen-eyed of you here will recognize John Haydock's wall house, but here it's rendered as a Persian miniature. This is an old project by my old office, FAT, but drawn through the lens of Piranesi. Here is another old FAT project, here drawn by the Archigram member, or in the style of the Archigram member, Mike Webb. So what you see here, I suppose, are experiments in how different systems of viewing the world come together to produce something new. The Gardens of Versailles, as reimagined through James Stirling's worm's eye axonometric view of the Flory building in Oxford, a kind of reinvestigation of the strange graphic space of early Zaha Hadid paintings, and so on and so forth. Now, what these tend to do, I think, is to break down where we naturally feel kind of boundaries in culture exist. And the importance of that, I think, is that, first of all, it challenges where we think things should occur, and then it also, I suppose, makes us try to imagine what might be possible if those boundaries didn't exist. So what would happen if we could cross-fertilize things which we felt were completely different species. Representation is very much, in these cases, about the visual language of drawing. But they're also, I think, very present in this selection of images is the idea of how the drawing communicates with its audience. Like, how does it set up its own space? How does it explain that space? And how do you, as the viewer of that space, begin to understand its own logics? So you could say these are all, I guess, forms of communication as well. We can understand architectural drawings, of course, as things which communicate. But I'd also argue that architecture itself is a form of communication. So quickly to show you an extreme form of what that means. This is a project by FAT in Holland, in Rotterdam. And it's a park and a community centre. But what you see here is a kind of very reduced form of architecture. In fact, it's a very simplistic form of architecture. It's essentially an industrial shed, the kind of building you can almost phone up and get it delivered the next day. Except you see it wrapped in something else. And that something else is something very unique to that specific location, to that town, to the people, and to the program of this building. And in that wrapper, you see a kind of an overblown supergraphic treatment, a supergraphic which affects the architectural material so much that it changes its shape, it changes its material, and it changes what it says. So essentially it becomes a building which talks or reads, almost like a kind of cartoon, left to right. So you see the entrance, which explodes as a very artificial tree canopy. You see the kind of jagged timber, which refers to the skyline of the oil refinery just behind the site. You see on the elevation facing the park this kind of almost single line which describes very different conditions which are all present next to this community. So from the gigantic infrastructure of the Rotterdam harbour to the abundance of nature to pitched roofs of small houses, all turned into an architectural form itself. So you could say here that the architecture is absolutely about communication. Architecture is almost a form of media, interchangeable almost with, let's say, a kind of billboard, or somewhere between a billboard and a building. So that's a very direct sense of how architecture can be communicative and how it might represent and how it might tell a story or contain a narrative. But I think in a sort of deeper sense, how architecture represents often involves thinking about how it re-represents. That's to say, how it understands its context, whether that's a physical context or a social context, historical context, disciplinary context, and how it then kind of takes that and replays it in a way which is relevant, perhaps new, or certainly important to that particular place. That, I think, has a lot to do with the act and the idea of copying. So kind of, if you were Prince Charles and you were looking at a landscape, what you're attempting to do is to produce a kind of, an image copy of the field of view that you have in front of you. Of course, for us, the act of copying is something which is embedded in the tools that we use. As native digital architects, we're always copying and pasting things, bits of text, walls, windows, all these kinds of things. But you could say it also has a much deeper disciplinary kind of foundation. So in the image below, this is from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and one of the two rooms they have there called the cast courts. Now the cast courts are a place where there are plaster casts of the most significant, or certainly what was considered in the 19th century to be the most significant pieces of Western art and architecture. You can see Michelangelo's David there, but also fragments of pieces of buildings and so on. And these were used essentially to teach. They were there, students would go and sit in front of them, and they would learn how to become a good architect, how to become a good designer by copying, and that tradition of the Beaux-Arts education. And a good student was someone who could copy very well. Of course, that's very different now when we have a very different idea of what makes a good student or what makes a good architect. You don't say that's a great architect, they do brilliant copies of things. There's a kind of anathema to the way we imagine, what good practice is. But there are stories within architecture which perhaps place the copy as a much more fundamental origin of where things come from. So the Vitruvian myth of the column, for example, is that the column is a kind of cultured representation of the tree. So the primitive human would use a tree to hold things up, but the kind of a civilized human would carve that vertical element, yet it still retains some element of its kind of representational origin as tree. Here, an image which shows it in this kind of halfway state. And of course, the same story applies to something like the Doric temple, which is a stone version of a building typology which was first built in wood. And when you begin to look at some of the details of what's carved into the stone, those are remnants of the ways in which you would construct in wood. Of course, they make absolutely no sense in constructional terms or structural terms for building in stone, but yet they remain as a kind of vestigial cue which reveals the origin. So you could say, in a sense, there's always this sort of cyclic reuse of the past in order to invent the future. As a modern analogy, when you look at your computer desktop, well, you're looking at a desktop. But of course, it's not actually a desktop. It's got a kind of reference to the thing which organizes it as conceptually in our mind. You could say in a more extreme sense, these are kinds of things that we could play with. Here, a basketball cast into clay, where the origin object and its remake, there's obviously a kind of difference between the two. A thing which is intended to bounce, made out of a material which, if you tried to bounce it, would obviously smash. These ideas also, I think, have some relationship to an idea which you could call the model. So we're used to, as architects, making models as small versions of a thing which will eventually become bigger. So you have the drawing first, then the model, then the building. But is there a way that we could understand perhaps all of these things as models? Maybe the building itself is simply a very large model, or maybe it's a model of the smaller thing, which was the original, which was the thing made out of cardboard. In fact, maybe, like this sketch suggests, we're always inside a model, looking at a model, being looked at, etc., etc. And perhaps this is a way to understand, I suppose, that relationship to the reenactment, the tree as the column, or the idea of representation, the drawing to the building, that perhaps these things are all simultaneous all of the time. Now, I'd argue that these ideas are not just things that we can use to invent new forms of architecture, but they're present in the way we can understand the world. So I'm going to show you this guy. This is Christopher Wren, one of the only British architects that you've probably heard of. And here he is. I don't know if can you see that very well? In the distance, you can see St. Paul's Cathedral, which is his kind of crowning work. And in his hand, he holds the scroll with the plans of that building. But his other hand is pointing towards this globe. Now, this globe is not a globe of the Earth, it's a selenosphere, which is to say a model of the moon. And Wren, alongside being an architect, like many of those kinds of people at the time, had many other interests, but his main interest was science, and particularly astronomy. And in fact, on his deathbed, he said to his son, who was writing a book about his dad, the famous architect, he said, I've spent my life in rubbish, which his son interpreted to mean, like, I spent my life doing architecture, working for that stupid king who could never make up his mind about what he wanted, and I should have kept on looking at the stars and being interested in the moon, and it would have been much more rewarding, and I'd have had a much happier life. I think this image shows where Christopher Wren's real interest is as he points to his crowning glory, the map of the moon. But I would argue that if you look at the moon, the model of the moon, and you look at the top of St. Paul's, perhaps even in Christopher Wren's mind, there was some kind of analogy between the two. Perhaps the dome of St. Paul's and the model of the moon might be the same thing. So, to sort of make that more palpable, this is a recording of all of the named sites on the moon recorded inside the dome of St. Paul's, which is where the reverberation comes from. I'll turn it up in a second. So this is essentially a kind of to reimagine Wren's dome as if it was somehow a model of the moon.
Sea that has become known, sea of crisis, sea of fecundity, sea of cold, sea of Alexander von Humboldt, sea of moisture, sea of showers, sea of cleverness, sea of islands, sea of the edge, sea of masculine, sea of nectar, sea of clouds, Eastern Sea, sea of serenity, sea of William Henry Smythe, foaming sea.
This is a kind of reimagining of a thing which we think we know. We think we know it has a specific meaning, but kind of reinscribes an alternative possibility for that thing's meaning, suggesting that architecture can be simultaneous, that there can be multiple narratives or multiple meanings that exist within one thing simultaneously. And that idea of the kind of double or triple or quadruple meaning, or the simultaneous appearance of architecture inside of itself in different forms, is, I guess, kind of embodied in this small experiment, which takes a garden shed, which is the smallest affordable unit of architecture that we could possibly 3D scan. So here's a shot of the software which is used to make a 3D model of whatever it is you're trying to make a model of, which extrapolates the photographs that you take into a three-dimensional model. And then this is it arranged with the original garden shed, when you can see that as an actual shed, then a version of that information scaled up, and then a smaller version of it placed inside of it. So essentially like a kind of Russian doll, one thing inside another, but a repetition of the same thing, a scan, the same information scaled up, where you can see the kind of deformation that the resolution of the scan has as it becomes bigger. Then inside, into the shed, where you find a smaller version of the thing which was bigger outside. So there's an idea here about a different form of communication, one might say, or a different form of representation, where the information becomes digitized, and that becomes transmitted into different kinds of materials, and as it does, it becomes transformed. But maybe all of these ideas are beginning to talk about a relationship to the world, or an idea of how architecture kind of comes into the world. Now, I think you've probably noticed that everything I've shown so far, and probably everything I will show you, has always got some kind of relationship. It's always got an origin point, which is something which already exists. And I would argue that the act of remaking is a really fundamental act. So the act of remaking the tree as the column, or the wooden temple as the stone temple, that is the site of invention. So the way you reimagine something which already exists into a new state is essentially where architecture comes from. And here's two stories, two myths of where architecture comes from. Here's Laugier's primitive hut, in which the forest kind of is architecture. And here's Adolf Loos. Well, this is not Adolf Loos, but this is a mound. And Adolf Loos talks, he writes, if we were to come across a mound in the woods, 6 foot long by 3 foot wide, with soil piled up in a pyramid, a somber mood would come over us, and a voice inside us would say, "There is someone buried here." That is architecture. But both of these myths suggest that architecture is not something which you invent. It's something that you come across, or something which already exists. It just needs to be found or discovered, which I think is a kind of an interesting idea to place alongside, you could say, what has been the prevailing myth of architecture in, say, the last 20 years, which is one of originality, of one of novelty. What happens if we begin to imagine, like Laugier, like Loos, that it's already there, we just need to work out what it is? What might that do to our relationship to the world that surrounds us? So to turn Adolf Loos back on himself, this project, called A Very Small Part of Architecture, which is taken from an essay by Adolf Loos, in fact the same essay that the last quote was taken. So I'll read a little bit more from Loos. So he says, "Only a tiny part of architecture comes under art, monuments. Everything else, everything that serves some practical purpose, should be ejected from the realm of art." So this famous Loosian monument, designed in 1921, a mausoleum, which was never completed, was never built, only existed as a set of drawings and later a kind of reconstructed model, but yet an image which is kind of canonical, part of the world of architecture that we understand, but from the world of the unbuilt, was the origin for building this, which was essentially a one-to-one replica of the very same mausoleum, built inside a cemetery in London. Except you'll notice here, the thing which was intended to be incredibly heavy and dark, solid marble chunks, is here built from very lightweight pieces of timber, stretched across its surface with netting, and then kind of illuminated to give it its presence. So the thing which was big, heavy masonry becomes almost a kind of apparition, in a sense, a kind of see-through, a kind of resurrection, a ghost of a thing which never quite existed. But the remake has its own internal issues. In fact, it has a whole range of politics and problems. And certainly these are issues which the Victorian art critic John Ruskin was very concerned with. So for him, the act of conservation was close to total demolition. He wrote, "Restoration, so-called, is the worst manner of destruction. The true meaning of the word restoration understood, it means the most total destruction which a building can suffer, a destruction out of which no remnants can be gathered, a destruction accompanied with false description of the thing destroyed. Now, of course, with a language like that, who could resist but make a project about it? And so this is a kind of an exploration of that Ruskinian space of the reconstruction as a form of total destruction in some senses. So these are two pieces which are fragments of, well, they claim to be fragments of antique pottery. This, the neck of a Roman vase. This, a fragment of ancient Greek pottery. Now, I bought them off eBay, so, you know, who knows? They came with a certificate. And obviously the work that we did then was to remake the thing which had been lost, so to remake the vase so it could become whole again. But in a way where you could absolutely see where the old thing was and where the new thing is, and where the kind of idea of form begins to collapse. So it's, as Ruskin says, very much a false description of a thing destroyed, but entirely, you could say, upfront and honest about its falseness. These ideas of like reconstruction and remaking have been ideas we've been exploring in a recent project, a recent competition project for a building in southwest of London, a place called Guildford. It was a 17th century mansion built by the Italian architect Leone, little known apart from his translations of Palladio's 4 books into English, wherein Leone also made some alterations, swapped out Palladio's, or some of Palladio's work and put in his own, made some improvements, which is, you know, kind of, if you're thinking about the kind of reworking of the past, is also interesting to think about. But Leone had a not very successful career as an architect in England, but he did build a number of houses. This one, Clarendon, was one of them. And this was it a number of years ago. But 4 years ago, it had a massive fire. And although the outside remained the same, the kind of incredible interiors, like this marble hall, were essentially lost. So from the basement to the roof, it was entirely gutted. You can see the kind of grandeur of some of the interior spaces as it was, and this is it now, like entirely kind of, you know, from basement to roof, a huge void. Absolutely amazing. And so the idea of the brief was to restore part of it, but then also to turn some of it into more contemporary exhibition and gallery spaces and various kind of other more contemporary uses. Our approach began not by thinking, well, we need to restore this 17th century mansion, but actually to go back further in time. So this was the house which existed on the site before Leone had arrived. This is a Jacobean house, so a kind of Elizabethan building which had been cleared away by the owners because they wanted to have the most fashionable new form of architecture. A few remnants of that house remained, fragments in some of the walls and some of the foundations. So our approach was to think of this building not as a thing which had a particular state at one time which needed to be restored to, but rather a building which had multiple states, which were all kind of, you know, layered one on top of each other. It took what was essentially a kind of Palladian building in the landscape, understood its axes and its relationships, both to kind of the city where the kind of power base for this family came from, but also to aspects of its landscape design, which had also been reworked. So part of it, its landscape was a capability brown, picturesque landscape. Some of it was a formal landscape from before that. Some of it was a much more recent car park. So a kind of, you could say, you know, 500 years of history layered one on top of each other, all simultaneous. In order to do that, we began to carve out within the framework of the building, within the volumes of the building, a series of what we called villas. The first one, a restoration of this, the marble hall, which was the original entrance. But ours began to create new uses, so a new public entrance, a new gallery space, a new learning space, these kinds of things, which all worked, I guess, sort of against and with a more strict a Palladian axial plan. But by creating these volumes through the building, you start to create relationships between these notional villas. In terms of the restoration itself, was to make, just like those Ruskinian pieces of pottery, was to make the act of restoration absolutely visible. So when it was, a kind of one-to-one replica of what had been there before, that would also be accompanied by things which were explaining the nature of the restoration, or explaining the principles of the geometry which underlie it, or explaining the drama of the fire, or the constructional principles of the building. So that as you move through the building, it's essentially a form of archaeology. So that even in gallery spaces, you would begin to read the kind of history of the building into those spaces itself. And certainly through the stairs, which become a journey through the archaeology of the house from its Jacobean origins up into its contemporary state. So here you could say the act of restoration was also an act of kind of explaining or extrapolating the various and multiple identities that one building has had over its lifetime and will have into its future too. This relationship between, I guess, the contemporary and the historic was part of this project, Villa Rotunda Redux, another Palladian-based project for the Venice Biennale, I think 2014. This was taking very clear historical reference, Palladio's Villa Rotunda, and beginning to think about it both in terms of the idea of the copy and the idea of the remake, and in terms of its own history. So if you think of the Villa Rotunda, first of all, as a piece of Palladian architecture, what Palladio was doing was essentially plundering the past, taking fragments of classical architecture, reworking it into a new typology. But you can also imagine it formally in terms of the plan, with its two lines of symmetry, that all you need is a quarter of the Villa Rotunda in it, then repeats in order to make itself. This is it in Vicenza. But of course, we also know that it's a building which has been serially copied. Here in London, Burlington House, built by Lord Burlington. Monticello, Thomas Jefferson in the US. And here, a much more recent one, in Nablus, in the Palestinian territories. An incredibly faithful copy of the Villa Rotunda. In fact, faithful to the drawings that Palladio made of the Villa Rotunda rather than the building which he had to build. Also interesting then to think, what is the original of the Villa Rotunda? These are just three of many, many examples of buildings either inspired or replicas of Palladio's original. Interested in this idea of the copy, interested in the idea of its reproduction, we were looking on what was then called Google Warehouse, now 3D Warehouse, so shareware models of all kinds of weird stuff available for download. So here's some examples of models of the Villa Rotunda. I'm sure, I don't know, maybe it was sat as some part of an assignment by some class somewhere, or maybe it's just a kind of weird hobby that people have. But you can see varying in skill, varying in detail. I think this was the one that we chose in the end. So we were also interested in presenting work at something like the Biennale, that it wouldn't be anything that we'd designed. So to sort of take our hand of authorship out of the equation, not to present ourselves as the kind of author, but rather to present a process. So this, first of all, taking a freely available, shareable model of a building. Secondly, to find a process which was simply about making or bringing that thing into the world. So related to the idea of the copy was the process of the mold and the cast, which of course intrinsically is about producing multiple versions of the same thing. And you see here a diagram of the process on the left in red, the mold, producing the cast, and then the final arrangement of the piece where you have mold and cast as 2/4 of this Villa Rotunda redux, as we called it. But of course, all of those conditions, mold on the outside, mold on the inside, cast on the outside, cast on the inside, produce these very different effects. Negative, positive, gloopy, accurate, inaccurate, that they change, of course, according to the role that they play in the process. But they also begin to play with, I suppose, what happens across that line of symmetry. So in Palladio's version, the line of symmetry simply mirrors, but here things change as they cross that line. Solid things become void, positives become negatives. So there's a kind of operational difference as soon as you cross that notional line. Things become the opposite of what they are, not just left and right, but materially too, which produces something like this in the end. And you can see the effect, the cast on the outside, but you're looking into the mold, to the negative of the exterior, where a column becomes not a solid thing, but a void. Of course, that's exactly the opposite of what a column is supposed to be, and what a column is supposed to do. It was important also that this didn't happen at the scale of what we traditionally think of as a model, but something so big that you could walk through it, so big that it was kind of almost architectural in scale. Perhaps also echoing that idea of, what is model and what is building, and perhaps they're much closer than we often think they are. And then the views of the things which don't look like the original at all, the outside of the mold, the inside of the cast. This plundering of history is, I think, a topic which is, I think, being hotly debated currently as the subject of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, whose title is Make New History, and features a kind of, I suppose, a generation of architects who have a much closer relationship to history or to the history of architecture than perhaps recent generations have had. We have been participating in it, making a project which responds essentially to these two projects, Adolf Loos's proposal for the Tribune Tower and Ludwig Hilbersheimer's proposal for the same competition. Obviously two polar opposites. Loos is a kind of appropriated, almost surreal tactic of placing a column in the place of a building. Hilbersheimer, much more rational, of kind of extreme rationalist proposal for a tower. This is what was actually built on Michigan Avenue, which is the real Chicago Tribune Tower, designed by Raymond Hood, which is a very kind of Gothamist skyscraper. But there's something strange which happens in the bottom of this building. So if you walk down Michigan Avenue, you see these kind of lumps stuck in the base of the building. And they're all lumps of different buildings. There's like a bit of the Colosseum, something from Pompeii. There's like lots of things. Of course, as Europeans, we have no idea what they are because they're American, like fought this and fought that, like a bit of the Badlands from South Dakota. But there's about 150 of these fragments. Now, it's a sort of tourist curiosity as they're shopping at the Disney store and other places on the Golden Mile. But it's also in its own kind of quaint American way a reprisal of this kind of thing, the Arch of Constantine, which is essentially a structure built out of many other structures. This idea of the kind of the the architecture of spolia, a thing which is made up of fragments of other things in order to become itself. Now, our tower takes reference from many of these elements and essentially creates a new tower that's it in the center by stacking one on top of the other. It's called the Chicago Pasticcio, which is taken from this project by John Soane, which is a column in the center of the Soane Museum in London, his own house, which he made by stacking up bits of buildings which he collected. And then he designed his own thing to put it on top because, of course, he wanted to have the last word. But I think this shows, first of all, a very interesting relationship to history where it's simply a set of building blocks where you can assemble it in order to create something of your own authorship. But it also has something of this kind of surrealist game of exquisite corpse where somebody draws a head, somebody draws a body, somebody draws some legs, and somebody draws some feet, unbeknownst to each other. And then finally it's drawn, you unravel it to reveal the monster which you've collectively authored. So this kind of stacking of the human body, or the kind of form of the human body with its kind of weird elements swapped in instead of them, and that Soanean idea of the stacking of history was the method essentially of producing these kinds of collages, which were kind of formal experiments in how do you bring together very, very different kinds of reference. And I suppose the question for us was, first of all, how do you bring those things which formally have a very different language, may have a very different scale, very different kind of materiality? How do you bring them together? What might you be trying to produce as you do? And also, what are the narratives which might be suggested as you bring together things from across time and space? What does it mean to place a rose window in a resurrection of part of the World Trade Center, for example? So this was the final collage, which then produces this, which then, imagined back into Michigan Avenue, produces this as a skyscraper. So you can think of this really as a kind of a layering, a kind of false archaeology, like not a false description of a thing destroyed, but just a false description in some senses. But that false description itself contains a whole set of narratives, a whole set of references which begin to build something which has a new, perhaps monstrous quality all of its own. But if these are fictions, there are stories, real stories, that are contained within objects. And in fact, perhaps objects, just as buildings and drawings, representation and architecture and models might all be the same kind of thing. Perhaps things can operate as documents. So here, exploring the same kind of digital technology I was explaining before, but using it in a very different context. Here in the migrant camps, which were around the port of Calais, for migrants who were trying to cross the channel. And you can see here essentially the kind of infrastructural difference. Here you can see the huge infrastructure for the smooth movement of goods across Europe. And then you can see the camp, which is full of people who are unable to travel any further. This is the kind of limit of their freedom, the limit of their possible kind of way they can traverse space. And within that camp, a whole series of temporary structures, informal structures, things which exist one day to the next and then are kind of changed, moved, or removed by the authorities. So this small structure was something that we scanned first and then reproduced as part of an exhibition, again at Venice Biennale, for the Victoria and Albert Museum as part of a project about the idea of digital conservation and digital preservation. In this case, it was thinking of, does that record, that three-dimensional scan, begin to preserve moments which are absolutely ephemeral, things which only exist perhaps for a day or even for less than that, but certainly things which are precarious. Now you think back to the explanation I gave of the cast courts. So this is the kind of record which a museum like the Victoria and Albert Museum holds, which is the stuff which is considered to be good, the stuff which is made for and by the powerful, the stuff which has survived, the stuff which has been cared for, the stuff which has gained significance as, we could say, the canon of Western art. Of course, this kind of structure is exactly the opposite. It's made by the most powerless. The question we were asking was twofold. One was, what would happen if these forms of digital preservation could be applied not to physical artifacts, but to situations? If you could preserve the immediate present, what might you choose to preserve? And the second was, what would happen if the record contained in those kind of annals of culture, like the kind of museum or the institution, could include stories which were not only of the most powerful, which were also of other forms of other kinds of stories. Of course, the irony was that during the duration of the exhibition, the original was destroyed as the French authorities moved in to clear the camps. So the kind of digital record of it is essentially a kind of act within the archive as a monument to that particular moment. So I talked a lot about things and structures and objects in space and about representations of things, but I think there's also issues of space itself, because you can imagine space too is a language, a form of coding, or even a form of narrative, and that these forms of organization often act profoundly upon us, that their meanings are absorbed by us and affect our behavior. Even a setup of a room like this, of course we accept it, that I get to stand here and talk to you guys and you have to sit down there and listen to me till I stop talking, which I'm sure you hope will be quite soon. But this, there's an inherent power structure in the spatial organization of this room. And I think in all architectural situations, we can begin to understand that certain kind of power relationships and ideologies are present in the space itself, which we can understand as social and political meanings. So to begin with, these are, again, forms of doodle, forms of sketches, which speculate on, I guess, the coming together of fragmentary forms of space. Kind of intersections of one thing with another, which generates in the gaps between them hybrid forms of space, one might say. Enclosed, open, broken, and so on and so forth. And within that, we can see things which we recognize. We can see, essentially, the walled garden, the kind of, in a sense, the most idealized form of architecture, where the wall creates a world within itself. Or we can read, like Nolly's map of Rome, a kind of the relationship of public and private, of spaces which are street and spaces within buildings which are actually interconnected. Or we might even understand the space of, imagined by Superstudio of the kind of continuous monument, the kind of world, wherever it might be, which is somehow overlaid with a grid. Of course, all of these things are acting on us all of the time. So the question might be, what do these things mean to us now? What does it mean, perhaps, to invert Philip Johnson's glasshouse, to take the painting which sits inside this kind of piece of architecture / vitrine, a painting, a Poussin painting, and set the glasshouse within the painting rather than the painting within the house? So these kinds of questions, I think, are spatially explored in projects like this, which is a exhibition design at the Design Museum for a show called Fear and Love. A show which, like its name suggests, is about ambiguity. Do we fear or do we love? In this case, things of the modern world, like robots, like contemporary food production, forms of technology, so on and so forth. And essentially the plan is very simple. It's a kind of curtain line which traces itself through this rectangular room. And as it does that, it creates moments which are interior, but then that line continues to also create things which are exterior. So you're never quite sure if you're inside or outside, or whether they're actually different conditions. So it produces a kind of explicitly, you could say, ambiguous space where you're never quite sure of your position in relation to, you could say, the architectural construct. The material itself, having some kind of translucency, also suggests this sort of ambiguity of whether you can really see through, or whether things are being obscured. And these are the same ideas which are at work in a small project for a building in London, where you can see a very strange site plan with this U-shaped end to it, which then produces which then produces an elevation which simply curves around that facade. But that route, as you can see, a staircase winding up the front of that building and around that curve and then into the building, that route then folds itself back inside the building. So it's taking an external condition and replaying it as an internal way of moving through the building. So that kind of relationship between outside and inside becomes, I guess, replayed or inverted. Which might also work on a programmatic level. So in one way as circulation, in another way as programs. This is a project called A House for Essex. It was FAT's last building. And it's kind of celebrated for what it looks like, for all of the stuff that goes on the outside. We work with an artist, Grayson Perry, who's well known for his ceramics. And so the exterior of the building is covered in essentially his ceramics. It's also a building which tells stories, very explicit stories, almost like a kind of devotional chapel. Wall by wall, window by window, object by object, it narrates the story of a person. But what I wanted to explain to you in more detail is something which happens programmatically. So it's called a house. It's not quite a house. It is more like a chapel, though it does contain a part you can stay in. At the top of the plan is a bigger room, you could say a kind of public space, smaller than this, but a double height space, which has a kind of non-domestic quality. The lower portion of the plan is the domestic space, the front door. You can see a staircase and a bathroom, and then a kitchen. Now, of course, in a normal house, the arrangement is a front door, more public spaces, and then more private spaces are somehow separated, often on a floor above. So there's a kind of arrangement of a kind of relationship between privacy and the world that happens through the organization of domestic space. Here, something different happens. So if I take you through on this plan here, you come through the front door, and if you were to go up the staircase, you find yourself on this landing. And there's very normal domestic things up here. There's bedrooms and there's a bathroom. You can choose to go into the bedrooms, you can choose to go into the bathroom. So here's the bedroom. Now, if you go through this door, you find yourself in a wardrobe. Again, that's what you expect in a bedroom. But if you go through that door, you find yourself on a balcony, facing into this big public space. Now, if you choose to go this way, you find yourself in the bathroom and you say, oh, I think I'm going to have a bath. I'll take off my clothes and I'll sit in the bath. And then you look out this window. So this would be the view in the in the bath. Now, that window is on axis, so it's the kind of, you know, if you were Louis XIV, you'd be like on your throne on axis. In this case, you're divested of your crown and your robes, even of your underwear, and you're completely in the nude, but in some senses on this sort of axial, very public point. If you choose to go through the bedroom, you go through that door there, and then out onto one of those balconies. Now, one of the things you maybe need to know about Grayson, the artist, is he's probably more famous for being a transvestite than being an artist. So his alter ego, Claire, is when he dresses up as almost a kind of like a Victorian doll, was exactly the outfit that he was wearing when he collected the Turner Prize. So it was a very public form of kind of cross-dressing. But in this building, I think it plays with the idea of like how architecture itself constructs you. So as you go through the wardrobe, you place your clothes on yourself and then present yourself to one world. Or you remove all of your clothes and present yourself to a world in another sense. Somehow that part of the domestic part of this project is about how, I suppose, the body and the world are framed by architecture itself. So if that's about, I guess, presenting yourself or how architecture constructs you, this is about the opposite, how simultaneous things are occurring. This is a very small project for an art gallery, but it's a very unusual art gallery. Instead of, it's actually a hair salon, but it's also a very unusual hair salon. So if you go, when you go to get your hair cut, you sit down and you look at yourself in the mirror and you kind of think, oh my God, I've got to look at myself in the mirror for the next, half an hour or whatever it is. In this case, you don't look at a mirror, you look at art. So this is the premise of the art gallery, is that you spend the time that you would be looking at yourself feeling uncomfortable, most likely, if you're anything like me. Instead, you spend it in a kind of valuable cultural pursuit of looking at something. And even looking at anything for 20 minutes is an incredible kind of thing to do. It's a very unusual, we don't do that normally. But of course, when it's something which is curated, when it's made specifically to be looked at, it becomes particularly interesting. So there's no mirror when you sit in the chair, but there are mirrors in other places, mirrors which double the space, mirrors which are used as spatial devices, mirrors which even recall Adolf Loos's use of mirrors in the American bar in Vienna. All of these things which alter perception of space rather than acting as something which is functional. But I think despite this incredibly small size, this is like 10 square meters, it's quite an intense experience precisely because it brings together two very unexpected programs, in some kind of quite demanding way. So the act of sitting becomes the act of looking. So in these ways, the House for Essex, this project, I think the one before it, I think these are beginning to think about how the sort of spatial coding of space also carries very particular meanings and frames experience in very clear ways. So to end the talk, I'm going to show you another film. It's going to include Prince Charles again, and it's going to include a clip of his TV show, A Vision for Britain. But it's paired with another trip down the Thames, which took place in 1977 on the occasion of the Queen's Jubilee, when the Sex Pistols took to the river to perform their special song which they'd written for the Jubilee, Anarchy in the UK. And it's essentially a kind of riposte to A Vision of Britain, an argument for multiple visions of Britain.
Architectural wonders of the world, London, a city built like the centre of another great trading empire, Venice, on the water. And when Canaletto painted it in the 18th century, no less beautiful. The London that slowly evolved after the Great Fire took about 300 years to build. It took about 15 years to destroy. What was rebuilt after the war has succeeded in wrecking London's skyline and obliterating the view of St Paul's in a jostling scrum of skyscrapers, all competing for attention. Can you imagine the French doing this sort of thing in Paris, on the banks of the Seine, round Notre Dame, or the Venetians building tower blocks next to San Marco? When did we lose our sense of vision? How could those in control become so out of step with so many Londoners who felt powerless to resist the destruction of their city? There is no need for London to ape Manhattan. We already possessed a skyline. They needed to create one. And there is no need for buildings, just because they house computers and word processors, to look like machines themselves. All around me is what used to be one of the architectural wonders of the world, London. A city built like the Centro of another great trading empire, Venice, on the water. And when Canaletto painted it in the 18th century, no less beautiful. The London that slowly evolved after the Great Fire took about 300 years to build. It took about 15 years to destroy. What was rebuilt after the war has succeeded in wrecking London's skyline and obliterating the view of St Paul's in a jostling scrum of skyscrapers, all competing for attention. Can you imagine the French doing this sort of thing in Paris, on the banks of the Seine, round Notre Dame, or the Venetians building tower blocks next to San Marco? When did we lose our sense of vision? How could those in control become so out of step with so many Londoners who felt powerless to resist the destruction of their city? There is no need for London to ape Manhattan. We already possessed a skyline. They needed to create one. And there is no need for buildings, just because they house computers and word processors, to look like machines themselves. All around me is what used to be one of the architectural wonders of the world, London. A city built like the Centro.
Maybe that's enough, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you for this kaleidoscopic vision of the world through your work and your anxieties. And I always expect for the audience to stand up and make a few questions to extend the pleasure to hear you. But actually there was one which kind of once I don't know if it's a simple question, but it relates to the idea of clarity and the idea of complexity and ambiguity and irony and the usefulness of the extreme wide array of things that you can use, that you don't hesitate to take on and to build on top of that. But there is always the verge of losing the clarity of a message, the clarity of an argument, clarity of a discussion that then allows a building to be built or an exhibition to be made or a drawing to actually represent. So how do you deal between this frantic enthusiasm for the things that surround you and the construction of a clear argument?
I think it's within a project itself. The logic of a project, I think, is the thing which provides the clarity, and that's to say, often the references themselves are chosen because of a position, because of a logic. So why one would ransack 150 kind of very different and not necessarily particularly important architectural references for the Chicago Tribune Tower is essentially because that suddenly becomes a kind of an extreme and unusual archive within the context of a project which is about appropriation of history. So it kind of forces us, us and me out of a kind of the selection that we might normally make. You know, the bringing together of two boat trips comes together after, you know, kind of, I guess, it comes out of a certain moment of it where a sort of spark of recognition is that there are these two boat trips down the river, down the Thames, 10 years apart, which talk about two very different visions of Britain. And suddenly that seems to put them into some kind of argument with each other, which also talks about the question of the, you know, what is London and what should it become. So I'd say the kind of source book is always open wide, yet the kind of way in which those particular elements should come together within a project becomes much sharper and much clearer, because they're working usually in some kind of either formal relationship or there's a tension between their subject matter, or there's something about the way in which those two things shouldn't necessarily coexist, which interrogates them in a way which produces something which I think is interesting or useful.
Good, thank you. So I think there is a microphone in the room if someone wants to engage with some questions, or if while you are still preparing them, I give you one more or two more questions before while you are still preparing them. And that brings me to the idea of the détournement that is extremely clear in the well, in many of the projects, but I was thinking especially of the Philip Johnson glass house regarding to the Poussin painting, and it brings this kind of constantly delving in the, let's say, arch of treasures, a Noah's Ark of architecture of our culture, and then twist things together, and then you go even after that on twisting the perception of space. You show interior, exterior. So when does it end in a way? When at some point architecture it has to. I lost myself in the question, but there is this idea of a certain moment that you have to represent something, you have to stand for something, you have to clarify some, again, the idea of clarity that regards the position that you are. But working with the détournement, you may be in the risk of being in an endless loop, and in this endless loop, you lose the meaning, you lose the sense.
But I think that, you know, I mean, it depends what you're looking for a particular thing to do, essentially. What it's doing in terms of like my own practice. So a project like the Glass House is a sort of speculation which keeps on going down a little sort of following its own nose. But at the same time, it's about a certain relationship, a very clear relationship between, you know, inside and outside, you could say, which is a kind of, you could say, a sort of surreal reinterpretation of a very obvious architectural idea. And I would say those ideas do have a very clear resonance in a sort of architectural resolution, in, let's say, the planning of the house for Essex. It was not direct, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but it's an understanding of a relationship between a certain sort of domestic quality, a certain kind of privacy, and a certain sense of publicness or exterior. So I mean, I think I showed tonight a lot of things which are much more kind of explorations rather than resolutions, I would say.
Yeah.
And the battle, I think, is not only in finding resolution, because you could also argue that architecture is all too capable of finding its kind of physical solutions without necessarily asking the questions of why that should be the case. So, I mean, in terms of, I imagine my own practice as being something which is always broad, that relies on the kind of, you could say, like experimental, or the things which don't quite know where they're going or what they're for or where they end, in order to discover the kinds of things which are then, you could say, clarified within an architectural project. But at the same time, to imagine that all of it actually is the architectural project, that building is part of a much wider set of forms of practice. So it's about that kind of resonance between things. And I think the capability to keep inventing or finding new forms of relationship which work two ways, whether that works backwards from building to something else. So I think, so I think it's about that. It's about an idea of practice, I would say, more than anything.
I think it's extremely interesting in the way that it opens up perspectives in a moment where publicly everything seems to be narrowing down and kind of entering into a closer and a more black and white universe instead of a colorful universe as you presented. So, are there any shy or less shy questions? There is one.
A little bit, yes. Did you reflect a little bit on the title of your lecture? You say adventures beyond architecture, but for me there's everything you do is a fundamental research into architecture.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, but at the same time, for me, it feels like it's often looking outside of architecture for kind of to help me think about things which are, I think, fundamentally architectural. And I think it's that oscillation again between the kind of wider world, wider kind of cultural moments, and what we could say is a much more defined definition of architecture. So you could say, the geography of the moon versus a cathedral. One, of course, is explicitly an architectural, one of which is the moon. And it seems to be often about placing two things together, one of which we know what it is, the glass house, for example. We almost, it's a kind of almost a caricature. It's very hard to think of it, even because we know it so well. But then to kind of make it strange by placing it into a different context, in that case, into something which is usually inside of itself. So there's often a process, perhaps, of like trying to, being able to place the familiar in an unfamiliar setting in order to perhaps derive some new understanding or new kind of revelation that comes from that kind of alchemy. So I think it's about architecture, but it's a view of architecture which is one which does include the moon or the mythical landscape of a Poussin painting. Both, to me, are intrinsically architectural kind of settings, architectural scenarios, but ones which are useful because it takes us out of the you could say, the specific context which architecture as a professionally sets itself within. which makes it much more about myth, much more about narrative, much more about its possible relationship to culture.
Good. So, there's another.
Hello. You're mentioning a lot, you're talking a lot about narrative, but I don't understand what is the story you want to tell at the end, because we see the college is quite nice, and but beyond the joke, what is the story you would like to tell, and where would it lead us to?
I would say the idea of narrative is not about a kind of a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. It's much more to do with an idea that architectural objects or kind of entities carry meaning intrinsically themselves, and that often what the work is doing is kind of fragmenting the expected. Well, first of all, it recognises that those things exist, which I think in relation to architecture and design is an important thing to state, that objects are documents, that objects are stories in and of themselves. They're not things which need to be narrated. They are narrations already. But they're not narrations in the sense of a novel or a film or even a piece of music, that they're things which exist in a kind of, you could say narrative exists in a different spatial and temporal form. I think the aim of a lot of the work is to put together fragments of these, in fact to undermine even the possibility of a full narrative to be told, so that there's simultaneous voices or simultaneous kind of entities which are existing side by side, or one on top of the other, or one behind the other. The reason I think that's important is essentially to kind of break open the possibilities for objects and spaces and buildings to kind of operate in a much more connected cultural sense, so that it's not a didactic thing which has a defined meaning, but it's something which has a kind of plurality of possibility still retained within the thing itself.
One last question.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. I was wondering, in which extent do you think architecture limits or promotes people's behavior? Or in the same context, if it's boring in general, because if you are an architect, you have to obey certain rules. If you are an artist, you are more free to work. And when we think about a space, a gallery, a museum, but more a gallery, or we think about the city, in which extent we could bring outside to the city something that we can do on a gallery.
I mean, architecture is a form of legislation in a way. It tells us how to behave, and it tells us what to do. And I think that's in terms of how we occupy it. Like the width of a street, the position of a building is a choice that has been made, which denies other choices in the first place, but also informs how we should behave, and of course in concert with invisible aspects of society. I'm not sure about the idea that art is more free than architecture. I mean, essentially, if you're operating as an architect or as an artist or as a designer or as anyone in form of creative practice, you are operating within a particular system. And of course, the art world is, I would say, far worse than the world of architecture. It may not have the same kind of legislation, but it certainly has a much more restricted possibility for you to operate as a artist who makes any money and who can live in the world. So I think in terms of like the two parts of your question, one is like, does architecture inform and sort of act with some control on the way that we behave? Sure. How we act as architects is a different question. So the discipline of architecture, I think, is not a discipline of the profession. The profession has certain demands, but those are not things that we necessarily have to obey. In fact, you know, one of the kinds of questions I think it's important to ask is, what is the role of the architect in our present moment? Like, what is it that we can do? What is it that we need to do? And that perhaps that's not necessarily a single solution for all of us in the room or every architect in the world. But that, I think there is always a necessity, rather than to expect the definition to come from, say, a professional body of like, this is what an architect does, is for you to make that definition yourself of what architecture is, and then to make the argument for why that's important to the world and in the world.
Thank you. Well, with this large and broad question, what are we doing all here? I think it's a good question mark to thank all of you to come here, and especially for your trouble to join us. And it was very nice to have you here tonight. And thank you. Gostava só de lembrar que no próximo sábado há o debate de encerramento da exposição Fernando Guerra, raio-x de uma prática fotográfica, que a exposição encerra no dia 15 e o debate é no dia 7, para preparar a última semana em que poderemos visitar a exposição. Um debate com o Carlos Muro e o Daniel Malhão. Muito obrigado.
Oh, no, I didn't speak about it. Wait. Oh, I guess